Good afternoon, second graders. I have been holding on to a chapter book for months, hoping that we would get to read it together. And finally, the day has come. I'm very excited to start reading to you Flora and Ulysses. This was written by Kate DiCamillo, and she wrote some children's book classics and young people's books classics like The Tale of Despero and Because of Winn-Dixie, The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane. And this is a book that she wrote for, I guess, younger audiences. I'd say like third grade and up, but I figured since you're so awesome and mature second graders that I would read it to you. So it starts off a little differently than most chapter books. It actually starts with a few pages of like graphic novel panels. So I'm going to read that to you first and then sit back down and then start reading the text of Flora and Ulysses, written by Kate DiCamillo and illustrated by K.G. Campbell. There we go. In the Tickham kitchen, late on a summer afternoon. Ahem. What is it, Donald?
Happy birthday to you. This is your birthday present. It's a Ulysses Super Suction Multi-Terrain 2000X. Happy birthday.
It's a vacuum cleaner.
It's a Ulysses 2000X. Yep, it's the crown jewel of vacuums. It features an extra long cord, so there's absolutely no mess, no dirt, is ever out of reach. It's indoor-outdoor. It goes everywhere. It does everything.
Goody.
You have to try it. Turn it on.
Oh, for heaven's sakes, Donald.
Please. Click. Hey, whoa now.
What in the world, Donald?
It's multi-terrain. You should try it outside.
And that's how it all began, with a vacuum cleaner. Really. Okay, here we go. Chapter 1, A Natural-Born Cynic. Flora Bell Buckman was in her room at her desk. She was very busy. She was doing two things at once. She was ignoring her mother, and she was also reading a comic book entitled The Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto. Flora, her mother shouted, what are you doing up there? I'm reading, Flora shouted back. Remember the contract, her mother shouted. Do not forget the contract. At the beginning of summer, in a moment of weakness, Flora had made the mistake of signing a contract that said she would work to turn her face away from the idiotic hijinks of comics and toward a bright light of true literature. Sounds familiar in our household, second graders. Those were the exact words of the contract. They were her mother's words. Flora's mother was a writer. She was divorced and she wrote romance novels. Talk about idiotic hijinks. Flora hated romance novels. In fact, she hated romance. I hate romance, said Flora out loud to herself. She liked the way the words sounded. She imagined them floating above her in a comic strip bubble. It was a comforting thing to have words hanging over her head, especially negative words about romance. I hate romance. Flora's mother had often accused Flora of being a natural-born cynic. Flora suspected that this was true. She was a natural-born cynic who lived in defiance of contracts. Yep, thought Flora, that's me. She bent her head and went back to reading about the amazing incandesto. She was interrupted a few minutes later by a very loud noise. It sounded as if a jet plane had landed in the Tickums' backyard. What the heck? Said Flora. She got up from her desk and looked out the window and saw Mrs. Tickum running around the backyard with a shiny, oversized vacuum cleaner. It looked like she was vacuuming the entire yard. That can't be, thought Flora. Who vacuums their yard? Actually, it didn't look like Mrs. Tickum really knew what she was doing. It was more like the vacuum cleaner was in charge, and the vacuum cleaner seemed to be out of its mind, or its engine, or something. A few bolts shy of a load, said Flora out loud. And then she saw that Mrs. Tickum and the vacuum cleaner were heading directly for a squirrel. Hey now, said Flora. She banged on the window. Watch out, she shouted. You're going to vacuum up that squirrel. She said the words, and then she had a strange moment of seeing them hanging there over her head, like a comic book. There is just no predicting what kind of sentences you might say, thought Flora. For instance, who would ever think you would shout, "You're going to vacuum up that squirrel"? It didn't make any difference, though, what words she said. Flora was too far away. The vacuum cleaner was too loud, and also, clearly, it was bent on destruction. This malfeasance must be stopped, said Flora in a deep and superheroic voice. This malfeasance must be stopped, was what the unassuming janitor Alfred T. Slipper always said before he was transforming into the amazing incandesto and become a towering crime-fighting pillar of light in Flora's comic book. But unfortunately, Alfred T. Slipper was not present. Where was Incandesto when you needed him? Not that Flora really believed in superheroes, but still. She stood at the window and watched as the squirrel was vacuumed up. Poof! Thump. Holy bagumba, said Flora. Chapter 2, The Mind of a Squirrel. Not much goes on in the mind of a squirrel. Huge portions of what is loosely termed the squirrel brain are given over to one thought: food. Sounds like my cats. The average squirrel contagion goes something like this. I wonder what there is to eat. This thought is then repeated with small variations. For example, where's the food? Man, I sure am hungry. Is that a piece of food? And are there more pieces of food? Some 6,000 or 7,000 times a day, these thoughts enter the squirrel brain. All of this to say that when the squirrel in the Tickums' backyard got swallowed up by the Ulysses 2000X, there weren't a lot of terribly profound thoughts going through his head at that moment. As the vacuum cleaner roared towards him, he did not, for instance, think, here at last is my fate come to meet me. He did not think, oh please give me one more chance and I will lead a good life. What he thought was, man, I sure am hungry. I hope that thing has food. And then there was a terrible roar and he was sucked right off of his feet. At that point, there were no thoughts in his squirrel head, not even of food. Chapter 3, The Death of a Squirrel. Seemingly, swallowing a squirrel was a bit much even for the powerful, indomitable, indoor-outdoor Ulysses 2000X. Mrs. Tickums' birthday machine let out an uncertain roar and sputtered to a stop. Mrs. Tickum bent over and looked down at the vacuum cleaner. There was a tail sticking out of it. Oh, for heaven's sake, said Mrs. Tickum. What next? She dropped to her knees and gave the tail a tentative tug. She stood. She looked around the yard. Help, she said. I think I've killed a squirrel. All right, second graders, that's all for today. Now you might be thinking, no, wait, what happened to the squirrel? Fear not, second graders. This takes a turn for the good. Turn for the good. Don't fear. We might see the squirrel again. Alive. And we'll find that out tomorrow. I hope you have a wonderful evening. I hope you have a yummy dinner. Maybe breakfast for dinner. We haven't done that in my house in a long time. Pancakes. Pancakes. Have a great evening, and I'll see you tomorrow for our next picture book read aloud. Bye.